Greetings again, my friend. Welcome to the podcast, Teaching That Transforms with Pastor Jimmy Knott. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm continuing my series, Gigantic Affirmations from Christ, the I Am sayings of Jesus. All 7 of these sayings found solely in the Gospel of John, whose sole theme was to highlight the deity of Jesus. Each of these 7 sayings give us tremendous insight into who Jesus is and why he came, his identity and his mission. Last time, we looked at the very first one of these out of John chapter 6. 3 times in John 6, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He supplies, he sustains, and he satisfies, just like bread. The backdrop of that, again, going as several of these I am sayings do, back to the wilderness wandering days of the Jewish people when they were freed from Egyptian bondage and making their way toward the promised land. They were hungry, and they complained to their leader Moses. And Moses called on the Father, and the Father provided. He provided quail for the evening meal, and he provided what was called manna for the morning meal. They were to gather the manna every day to have food. And that manna was food, sustenance for the day, but only for the physical. That manna was provided by God, but only for the people of Israel. When Jesus, in that backdrop, said, I am the bread of life, and he did that in reference to a question about our fathers received manna from Moses in the wilderness in John 6. And Jesus said, no, I provided that. I'm the giver of the bread of life. So to the hungry, Jesus said, we looked at it last time, I am the bread of life. Today we look at the second gigantic affirmation of Christ when he says in John chapter 8, verse 12, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Few things are more important in our world than in light. If you don't believe that, just go into a dark room without any light, any way to illuminate anything, and you'll get the point. When you go back all the way to the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, isn't it interesting that the first thing that God created was light? That alone speaks to the value of light. There are only 3 terms in the Bible that are used to describe the essential character and nature of God. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. John 4:24. God is love. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. 1 John 4:8. God is light. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. 1 John 1:5. Again, all of these from the gospel writer John. Someone put it this way, light is the shadow of God. When we come to John 8, there's an inseparable relationship going on really in John chapter 6, 7, and 8. And a lot of it is connected to Jewish history and the wilderness wanderings. And again, in chapter 6, Jesus is presented as the bread of life, replacing the temporary manna. And frankly, in John 7, though he doesn't use the term I am, he presents himself as the living water. Water was drawn from the rock by Moses under God's instructions. And when we come to John chapter 8, they're looking back on the pillar of the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that God used to guide the people of Israel. And Jesus claimed to be the fulfillment of all of those types as well. And when we come to John 8:12, Jesus makes this great second affirmation, I am the light of the world. Again, another picture of who Jesus is and what he came to do. And again, it creates continuing and increasing conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders about who Jesus is and what he came to do. Let me give you a little bit of background of what's going on. The Feast of Tabernacles, which is recorded earlier here in John chapter 7, really has just ended. It's an 8-day feast. It's the last of 7 feasts in the Jewish annual calendar. And that feast looks back and commemorates and remembers the wanderings of the wilderness and God's faithfulness in providing for them and protecting them and in guiding them through the wilderness and eventually into the promised land. They did not want to forget what God had done. And this feast lasted 8 days. But on the first night of the feast, for 7 straight nights, just before dark, they would have an illumination of the temple ceremony. To help you to understand how spectacular this was, if you could just kind of close your eyes and look at the old city of Jerusalem. For then it was a big city. And if you looked at the landscape of the entire area of the city of Jerusalem, you would see what stands out almost like a sore thumb, this huge rectangle, which could be described as the Temple Mount. It was some like a rectangle. The long sides were, over 500 yards, and the shorter sides over 250 yards, some 170,000 square yards. It just stuck out. It would stick out when you look at the landscape of this entire city. That was the Temple Mount. Inside of the Temple Mount was a structure that was 80 yards by 200 yards. That was the temple proper. The temple proper. Just inside the Temple Mount up to the temple proper, that was the court of the Gentiles, where the Gentiles were free to roam. But when you enter through the beautiful gate into the temple proper, you entered into the court of the women, where offerings were taken, where the treasury was kept, where oils and wood were stored. Then if we kept moving, we would move inside another area, which was the court of the Israelites, the men. And inside of that was the court of the priests, where they would offer sacrifices. And inside of that was the most sacred places of the holy place and the Holy of Holies. What Jesus said, he said in John chapter 8, these words, it says, Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. So Jesus is in the court of women, and it's a huge court, 80 by 80 yards. And it would hold 1,500, maybe 2,000 people. And what would happen just before dark, 4 huge candelabras would be set up. You say, how huge? They were almost 70 yards high. Can you imagine? And then obviously young and physically able priest would take 1 1/3 gallons of oil, climb the ladder, fill the bowl, and light the candles. 4 of them, some 70 yards high. Darkness now has enveloped not just the temple, and not just the Temple Mount, but all of Jerusalem. And no matter where you were, you could see this magnificent light lighting up the sky. Well, that ended. And now it's the next day. And in the midst of this same court of the women where the treasury was, Jesus proclaims, I am the light of the world. Not just the light that the Father used, the pillar by cloud by day and fire by night, to guide you as a nation Israel into the promised land. I am the light of the whole world. Can you imagine the connection that they were making based on this wonderful ceremony? Let's think for a minute. What's light do? What's the purpose of light? Well, basically, it's to dispel darkness. Light's purpose is to penetrate darkness and then to illumine the way. Often in Scripture, there are contrasts, and light and darkness are often contrasted in Scripture. Because just think for a minute, intellectually in Scripture, light refers to knowledge and to truth. Darkness refers to error and to ignorance. Think about it morally, the contrast. Light speaks to purity and holiness, while darkness speaks to sin and to evil. And Jesus makes that contrast here in John 8:12 when he talks, when he says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. We live in a world that's in spiritual darkness. It is spiritually ignorant, and it is morally evil. If you don't believe that, if you take a local paper, look at your local paper for 2 or 3 days, and just take note of the articles in the paper, many from just a local perspective, that make references to bad and evil and terrible things that have happened. And then get on the internet and look at what's going on in your state and nationally and internationally. I'm telling you, we live in a world of darkness, and it seems like it's getting darker. And the light of the world, Jesus, is so powerful. I mean, look at our own personal lives. When you and I accept Christ, a great change takes place in our life. Once we were in darkness, and now we have the light of life, and we can see our way through life as He lights up the way. We no longer walk in darkness because we have in Him the light of life. Why is Jesus called the light? I love what this writer said. To the darkness of falsehood, He is the light of truth. To the darkness of ignorance, the light of wisdom. To the darkness of impurity, the light of holiness. To the darkness of grief, the light of joy. To the darkness of death, the light of life. So, what is our obligation to this life? What must we do related to this life? Jesus tells us, He said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. I think there are two things. One, we're to follow Him. There's probably no phrase that more defines what it means to be genuinely Christian and to live Christianly with our lives. It's a phrase, follow me, that Jesus used more than any other recorded phrase in the gospel records. It means to believe in Him, to trust in Him, and to seek to follow Him with everything that we are and everything that we have. So our obligation to the light is first to receive the light and to follow the light. And then next, it's to shine as lights. Jesus says in this passage, and He repeats over and over, I am leaving you. His earthly ministry was almost over. What was He going to do? What would happen to the light in the dark world? Well, that's where you and I come in as followers of Christ. He left us to be reflectors, to let Himself shine through us. We have the light of His life in us. We are to shine as lights in a world of darkness. He is the source. We don't have to produce the light. Isn't that great? We just need to reflect it and to let it shine through us. He and He alone is the light of the world. And just like in each one of these I am sayings, especially those sayings that are related, were given to the public audience, which is most of the 7. How was the response? Well, as it always was true about Jesus, some received or believed, and some rejected and refused to believe. I hope, my friend, that you have embraced the light and that you're doing your best to let His light shine through you in whatever part of a dark world that God has entrusted to you. He came to light up this dark world. He is the light of the world. Let me close with a little bit of a warning of a great danger. You can be in the presence of the light. They were, and yet many still walked in darkness, as did most of those Jewish people and the religious leaders. John recorded in 1 John 1:6, if we claim to have fellowship with Him, yet walk in darkness, we lie and we do not live by the truth. Be sure, my friend, that you're not just in the presence of the light, but you have believed on the person and you have invited Him to be the light of your life. If you have, then shine well, my friend. For the question is not, is Jesus Christ the light of the world? He is. The question is, how brightly are you shining? Thank you. Thank you for listening to Truth That Transforms. Remember, it only transforms us when we apply it. Blessings from Pastor Jimmy. I'll see you next time.